Good afternoon, everybody. I was so excited to see you as I was walking out, but now I can see nothing but lights. Welcome to the Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture for 2024. I'm Carol Allman Morton, the Executive Director of OLLI at Berkshire Community College. We're so delighted to have you here with us today. This lecture is a wonderful example of the importance of philanthropy to allow OLLI to expand our programming and make it available to the community as part of our mission. Thank you to the Mahaiwe and all of the amazing staff and volunteers who made today possible. Thank you to Berkshire Gas for your ongoing support of this event. And now I'm honored to introduce the president of Berkshire Community College and our biggest supporter, Ellen Kennedy.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the 16th Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture. Mona Sherman played a transformative role in the growth and expansion of OLLI at Berkshire Community College. This lecture series, established through the generosity of her family and friends, honors both her love of the Berkshire community and of lifelong learning. And I think we have Art and Enid and many other friends out there, so welcome and thank you so much for making all this possible. OLLI at BCC is growing and strong. This week, we hit our highest membership number in our history, 1,575 members. Pretty powerful. OLLI is expanding programming with more interdisciplinary opportunities, active living and learning classes, and workshops, and continues to offer wonderful courses that are free and open to the public, like lectures like this. We are excited for our upcoming summer classes, in person and online, and if you haven't had a chance to sign up yet, you still can. Thank you for being here today. And now I would like to welcome Lisa Sharkey to the stage. Lisa is Senior Vice President and Director of Creative Development for HarperCollins Publishers, where she has acquired and overseen the editing of more than 75 New York Times bestsellers. Right. Before her success in book publishing, she held executive positions in television with Good Morning America, Inside Edition, and a number of others, winning 2 Emmy Awards. She was part of the Peabody and DuPont award-winning team at ABC News that covered the events surrounding September 11th. And a huge congratulations this year to Lisa, who has received the Arts and Sciences Distinguished Alumni Award from Washington University in St. Louis. I'm sure that was incredibly meaningful to her. She's a passionate alumna of that institution. Lisa is also recognizable for selecting the extraordinary Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture speakers we present each year. Thank you, Lisa. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone, and hello, Great Barrington. It has been a year unlike any other, and just wanted to begin by wishing us all a year ahead of tranquility and peace, as there has been a lot of pain and loss throughout the world, and I just want to say, you guys fill me up. I have so much gratitude for all of you who continue to pack these seats every year, year in and year out, for the Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture. My mom would be thrilled that her legacy has lasted well beyond her lifetime. She was a huge fan of MSNBC, obsessive viewer of MSNBC. She had to know what Mika was wearing every day, and where did she get it from, and could I call her and find out? Mika Brzezinski was our first ever Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture speaker, and she would be thrilled that for our Sweet 16, we have Ari Melber. So very excited about that. Also, many, many thanks to the wonderful Ellen Kennedy, or as last year's speaker, Jamie Raskin, would call her, President Kennedy from Massachusetts, home of Hollywood. I want to express so much gratitude as well to the women who do it all at OLLI, from Carol Allman Morton to Judith Weiner, Karen Norton, and Ray Langsdale, as well as the team here at the beautiful Mahaiwe, Executive Director Janice Martinson and her team, which include Gabe Napoleon, Lucas Poleski, Michael Booth, Jeff Benham, and really all the volunteers. Can we just give the volunteers a round of applause? And the man who we are all here to listen to this evening is someone who brings clarity, strength, stability, and sensibility to the often disturbing and dumbfounding news cycles. So I do consider it a huge blessing and an honor that Ari Melber has trekked north to the Berkshires. Ari is exactly who we need now, a voice of reason. An Emmy Award-winning journalist, lawyer, writer, thinker, talker, music lover, and wonderful human. And his nightly program on MSNBC, The Beat with Ari Melber, is, as they used to say in the days of NBC, must-see TV. In a world with an epidemic of ephemeral content, Melber's program is the longest-running 6 p.m. show in MSNBC history and one of the highest-rated shows in all of cable news. He is also MSNBC's chief legal correspondent, an NBC News legal analyst, and his writing has been published extensively across some of the biggest names in journalism, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Politico, and Reuters. I'm also honored to say, as a HarperCollins employee, that he penned the foreword to the HarperCollins edition of the January 6th report, which was an instant #1 bestseller. And the first line of his introduction was, "They attempted a coup." Ari will be talking about how technology threatens to further upend our already severely polarized politics, and as election season coincides with stormy Trump trial season, Melber will weigh in on the ex-president's legal troubles and what we can expect as spring and summer turn to fall and all eyes turn to MSNBC and their impressive election coverage. Shout out Steve Kornacki. And as we head into a particularly fraught election season with two relatively young presidential candidates, emphasis on relatively here in the Berkshires, I want to give a heartfelt but I do want to give a very heartfelt shout out to my stepfather, Art Sherman, who is 95 years young and in the audience tonight. And hi, Art. A couple of notes after Ari's talk. We are going to open it up for Q&A, and you can line up at the mics, and Ari will stick around for a little bit, for a little schmoozing and mingling afterwards. And again, thanks everyone for being such great supporters of this wonderful annual event honoring my mom. And now, let's welcome Ari Melber to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's great to be with you. Appreciate it. Really, really excited to spend a little time with you here on this Saturday. Can you hear me okay? Good. All right, good. If you wanted to do just an hour on the trial that Donald Trump's been facing and the election, I would argue that you already get that on the beat if you choose to watch it. So today, what I want to try to do is, as mentioned, is talk a little bit big picture about other things, how we got here, why things might be the way they are, why some things are so challenging and bad, basically. And then in part two, get into the trial. I was just there inside the room watching Michael Cohen 30 feet that way and the defendant Trump 20 feet that way, and share stories and reporting about that as well. So if you want, you can think of part one as something to maybe listen to, tune in and out, and then part two will be the payoff. Just so you have a guide. Sometimes I go to see stuff and I'm like, yeah, it would be helpful to know, right? And I say that because part one might be a little bit more vegetables or big picture, but again, I thought, given this nice invitation to come spend time with you on a Saturday, maybe we'd pull back from the daily news cycle. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about how technology is affecting us, and not just in the traditional ways that we think about it. I will start with law, because that's something I know a little bit about, and you might know that from watching me. And when we think about law, we have all this different language about it, and sometimes it has this presumption or deference that law is fair or just, or it's supposed to be right. I went to law school, and the more I learned as I went, I felt like that's not true, and the reason is pretty simple. Most law, if you divide law between what judges do and the statutes, most of the statutes are just old politics, right? So when we say, oh, here's this law from the 60s or the 1860s, it's the politics of that era. And so when you realize that, it sort of resets what law is. And if it's old politics, then what shapes the politics of the time? And what I'm going to argue to you today is that technology is sort of the key driver of a lot of our politics. And that was true back when it was ancient technology. So sometimes now when we say tech, you think of like the latest thing. But tech, by definition, is just anything that is the technology or the ability and the infrastructure of the time. And so I'm thinking of tech, as I'm going to discuss it with you right now, as the capabilities of the available tools of the time, how people learn information through media, how you can organize yourself through that process or that technology. And so just to kind of give you specifics, which I always try to do, let's be clear and as simple as possible, I'm talking about things like the printing press, pamphlets, newspapers, then radio, TV, of course now internet. Email lists would be a type of technology, right? Whether it's an annoying one that you can't get off of or one you want to be on, that's actually a way of organizing, self-organizing. And nowadays we have social media, AI, and a lot more. So if you take TV, which is probably why we're all here, right? You saw me on TV once or twice, and now we're here doing this. Television has completely upended and constrained most of politics in most Western democracies. That sounds like a big statement, but if you think about it, I think it's defensible. I think there's evidence for that. Just this week, we had this news about the debates, right? The president decided he is going to debate the former president, and there was all this scuffling about that. Now they've reached a deal. When we say debate, though, we don't mean a rally. We don't mean them meeting up and then us reading about it. We mean literally and only the televised debate. It's made for TV. And I know, by the way, I work on TV, but I've had other jobs before this, so I don't mean it like I'm trying to be biased about TV. But television as a technology has created realities that then become how we adjudicate politics. I think you could make an argument that in many election years, close election years, the TV debates are some of the only times that a large portion of the public sees both candidates, like outside of like a soundbite, and then that informs their decisions. And so you have this loop between the technology of the time. Do we do it through TV as we do now? Do we do it through the internet as we're doing more? Or the ancient times that actually creates the democracy dynamic that we're in. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about three types of sort of technology culture. Most of human history, if we go back, so everything I just said is about like, okay, this and last century-ish. If you go back, though, through most of human history, it was all oral culture. There were other types of communication. I mean, you had cave paintings, art, right? But most of culture and most of what we understood to be civic, political, religious culture was exchanged verbally, orally. The printing press, of course, famously changed that. That was a tech breakthrough. Nowadays, we have the internet, right, where everything has been opened up in profound ways. You've heard the cliche or the idea, everyone's a writer, everyone's a publisher, everyone can be a videographer. And so I want to give some credit here, although I'm not going to make this talk full of quotes and footnotes, but there's a professor, Larry Lessig, who's explored this, and he talks about how we've gone from what was oral culture to read culture, the post-printing press, and we think about everything we do in school and everything we do when we tell kids, this is how you learn, right? This is all reading, to a new form, which I'm going to get to. So to keep it simple, right? Oral culture, that's most of history, you're around the campfire telling stories. Stories are passed on orally, verbally. Reading culture after the printing press and schooling, that's like how everybody learns. And then the next one we're going to get to. When you look at what oral cultures do, and anytime you generalize, people would say, okay, is that fair? No. Is it full of nuance? No. But I'm going to give you a couple simplifications which I think will be relevant to our politics and what's wrong with our politics. Oral cultures, traditionally, they prize a clear narrative. They tend to have less fidelity. They care less about every detail being accurate, but they have a shareable or sticky story, right? A narrative story that if you can only share it orally, you got to remember it. And not everyone has a perfect memory. So the things that stick are shared. Oral cultures can also tend to be more creative or fluid. They also tend to rely more on faith or sometimes conspiracy theories. because it's the simple, big, single explanation that is shared. Reading cultures tend to prize a foundational text. That could be a constitution, could be a religious text. We obviously are partly in a very reading-oriented culture, and I mentioned law, and there's a lot of lawyers who become politicians and lawmakers and Supreme Court we can get to. We're a very legal culture. Legal culture, like religious culture, is a reading culture. And it's not only that there's a text, but in a culture like that, people will turn back to the old text for guidance. So we could have a brand new challenge, something we've never seen before, and that could be a personal challenge if you're in a religious culture, it could be ethical, could be technological, political, whatever, and people say, well, what does the text teach us, right? What do the Ten Commandments tell you should do? What does the First Amendment say about this? And on the one hand, this is so normalized as to be obvious. On the other hand, you can argue it's kind of weird. Like, I'm a lawyer, and so I'm very used to it, but like, here's this brand new challenge. How do we regulate organ donating? How do we deal with AI? And you go back to, well, what did they say in the late 1700s? And it's like, what did they say about this? Probably nothing. Okay, but what would they say? And then you're like, well, how much better are they than us that we're going to spend our time debating with historical texts what they might have said about AI or a procedure to terminate a pregnancy, rather than like what we would say today. And that's what I'm saying is underneath that legal debate is reading culture. And so you see this fidelity or this turn to the text. Now we get up to today, and we have this new thing, and it's what I mentioned the Professor Lessig calls read-write culture. And by that he means we had oral, we had reading, but now with the internet, and especially your kids and even grandkids who are growing up in this, read-write culture is very new, so it's the newest form of culture. The others lasted literally, oral culture was tens of thousands of years. Printing press, right, 1500s. Now where this new thing is a couple decades, 3, 4 if you want to call it that. And read-write culture has a whole different foundational energy. Think about remixes, memes, interaction. It's not the thing, it's the response to the thing. It's not the response to the thing, it's the comment on the thing. And that is the default mode of many young people who are growing up in this culture, because everyone can react and shape status. There's a lot less deference to the original, right? The notion of, oh, let's check what the founders think, they might not even care what their parents think. And they're more armed and with tools and publishing than ever before to just supplant or do their own thing. And I think that reaction is sort of the currency of that type of culture. In the beginning of this, what I'm calling this era, in the internet, you had a lot of optimism. There was kind of a liberal, progressive thing going on. If you look at the early internet, there were people affiliated with the Grateful Dead and counterculture and other stuff. Then there was Silicon Valley that had a little more conservative lean, but it was almost more like libertarian. The internet will set us free, everyone can speak. And that sort of was the early mood. I do want to do one show of hands, because I think if I do this, I can see some of you guys, otherwise I can't. Because I have some theories about the room, but I always like to get evidence first. By a show of hands, would you say you regularly get news and information from, and I'm going to say first, because hands up and down, first, print newspapers? Yeah, that's a lot, right? Now this one's I have a hunch about, but also TV news. Yeah, that's like, so most of what I see here, most of the room is on both of those. Internet-only outfits, so I don't mean like the Times online, but something that's just only a website, like the Daily Beast. Yeah, less. Facebook. Some hands and some hissing, okay. Twitter, which is now X, and that would be if you ever used it, like before Musk bought it, like some, okay. And the last one, I'm just curious, TikTok. Okay, in the middle, you're like, she was raising it like, no, you can, yeah, there you go. Again, I don't have a judgment one way or the other, but this is very interesting to think about how we all get our information. So people under 40, and generally the next generation, and there is data on this, are moving mostly towards those later ones I mentioned that are largely digital. TikTok, for example, this past year for the first time was the first platform to surpass Google in overall traffic for the last decade. And that's a remarkable fact that I think has a lot of implications. I'm not here to give you a speech about something's perfect, something's terrible. That's not generally my vibe, and I think it's more complicated than that. But I will tell you that a lot of the current digital platforms have a lot more challenges and downsides than some of the other technologies I mentioned. We can track, for example, that Facebook will push people to more and more extreme versions of their own politics. So if you are a moderate conservative, it will keep feeding you to go down the line to keep you engaged, a more extreme version. And likewise, if you started out as a moderate liberal. Twitter, before Elon Musk bought it, I think its problems have actually gotten worse, but I'm not even talking about his politics. Twitter as a tool, like I said, TV was this tool, and as a tool, Twitter is gamifying your words. So we're all human, we're all social. Most people would rather say something at a dinner party that people liked or respected than that made everyone completely angry at them. So we have those tendencies. But Twitter takes it to this next level and then bifurcates it. So you're finding your people and you're all cheering each other on and you're literally competing over who can be repeated most, retweeted most. YouTube, which I think is an incredible platform and in many ways a democratizing platform, people who don't have a lot of money or can't afford cable or can't afford a paywalled newspaper subscription can get a lot of good, interesting, and accurate information on YouTube. So, and Google bought YouTube. But having said that, YouTube as an engagement technique, if you're searching for something factual, it will always offer you non-factual things that might be more interesting or entertaining. That's fundamentally different from if you search inside the New York Times, which is not a perfect publication, and some of its stuff, when you look back on it years later, they did get things wrong. But their North Star and what you can find in there has these boundaries, and YouTube doesn't. So you can search for a fact, and there's studies on this, and YouTube will give you the interesting conspiracy theory about that fact or the fact. And then a lot of people, where do they gravitate? Towards the other stuff. TikTok is specifically algorithmically designed to give you only what you want to hear and what will keep you engaged and nothing like the other side. So when you look at TikTok, which I just saw many of you don't use, but you've probably heard of it, familiar with it, there's now a bill to divest it from China or ban it. One of the first things that spread on TikTok when it started going global across borders was one of the oldest human activities of our ancestors, dancing. Dancing is pre-cognitive, it's pre-language. It relates to music, which some of you guys know I'm interested in music. And there was a drum around the campfire before there was any of this other stuff that we think of in society. So here you have this brand new recent technology that is international, that can go viral in hours. And what is shared is one of the oldest things. And I think compared to what's been moving around on TikTok and politics, we should wish we were back in the innocent days of 5 years ago when people were doing dance-offs. But that stuff obviously could spread in different countries without a language barrier. It was family-friendly. In fact, there were people where parents and children would teach each other dances. And all of this stuff would share. So you might be thinking, all right, Ari, that's a lot. When do we get back to politics? Like I came here for a Saturday politics lecture. What the hell are we talking about? And this is what I would tell you and why I think this is so important. Thus far, with this tech thing I'm talking to you about, I haven't mentioned the former president who's running again, who's on trial, the current president by name, political parties, ideology. What we're talking about is what we often forget day to day when we talk about politics or what we in the news cover. It'd be weird if this was like the top 10 minutes of my broadcast. I think people would be like, what is going on? But this is what I would argue undergirds so much of what we're dealing with, including the polarization, the hatred, the conspiracy theories that are only strengthening. And that means that what we're really talking about is the deeper structures that are underneath our so-called political topics and divides. And so I'm not as optimistic as some that if you get around this person or that opponent or this politician you don't like, then you'll get what? The narrative or the vibe is like, we'll go back to better times. I'm not sure that's the case at all. I don't know. But if you look at it through this lens, it may not be a coincidence that, I will now mention him, that Donald Trump rose through one medium, TV, he's a reality TV star, and then mastered some of the divisive types of the social media and what I call the read-write culture, because he was very skilled at using Twitter and a couple other platforms to drive media, to drive narrative, and then he didn't win he didn't win the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. And so we have to think through as a society, and I think this is true in America, but it's probably true in multiple countries, whether we're good with all this and we're thinking about it the right way and we just keep it going, or whether we actually as a society need to make changes or regulate how we're using these very powerful tools. The largest companies in the entire stock market are all big tech companies. So if you're in politics, you're interested, the market's over here, you don't always think about it. That's a profound shift in what is valued in the market and what our country runs on. It's Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and this AI firm, NVIDIA. So these are incredibly powerful companies, and I don't think they are at all regulated like older, smaller, less powerful companies were. I think they've benefited from being so new and moving so fast that they're not even regulated about any of the issues I just mentioned. I'll give you a very concrete example. There are rules about what you can say on television. There's free speech, but there are rules. So things that relate to nudity and swearing are actually regulated. And that's just on TV. There's not a single rule in US law today about how AI can be used or not used in the election, in information, in conspiracy theories. And these are, I would argue, far more powerful tools, and I mentioned how far TikTok is reaching, than like whether people watch this or that broadcast or there's a swear word. When you look at ownership, I mentioned there's a new law now dealing with TikTok ownership in China, which is a big breakthrough, but historically, there have been all these rules about whether one company in America can own, for example, this much of a newspaper and this much of a TV in the same region, that you can't have media monopolies, okay? I think those are interesting rules. They may be perfect, they may not be perfect, but they go to the idea that those things matter and that if one giant company owns all the media in your town, they're going to be able to swing elections and do other things, which makes sense, right? We don't have anything like that for most of these big tech companies. And so I'm getting near the end of part one, and then we'll get to the good stuff, okay? But if we're all going to take a minute on a Saturday and think beyond the news cycle, I think that some of the problems we see and the cultural moments that we're in are driven by these platforms, which isn't to say we're all brainwashed, but it is to say that if you feel like conspiracy theories are on the rise, attacks on facts are on the rise, and everyone under a certain age is basically defaulting to getting their information, not just news, but like a lot of their information from these platforms, then I think I could argue that we are slipping from this progression we talked about, from oral culture to read-write culture, back to oral culture, right? Back to, I saw the video, I saw a clip of the video, I shared it, I told someone about it, and we're in that mode. And in some ways, the reason why that is so seductive is that's what we've been wired for tens of thousands of years. This other stuff is pretty new. And these companies are really skilled, and they are not here to make us better citizens or make sure we don't go to war or make sure we're informed. They're only here to maximize their profits. And I don't say that as an anti-capitalist. It's just literally true. And so these companies are doing that thing, and they're preying on something that we're like so primordially prepped for, which is that. And my other question before I get to part two, because we'll do the lights again, is how many people here, you'll like this one, I think. How many people here have read a book in the last 3 months? Yeah, good for you guys. I think that's great. Outside of school, which is like a job, I would put that differently, right? A lot of younger people are not reading books. You guys know about that, right? And so what's filling up that space is not just exercise or walking or socializing. There's a ton of content filling that space. It's in video, and it's in short form video, and it's in viral video. And I'm really interested in new technology, just like new music, so I really hope, if I sound like old and curmudgeonly and whatever, fine. I hope I don't, because I don't mean that all this stuff is bad, but I do mean that if you have that deeper lens and any of that is possibly true, I raise it for your consideration, then we're slipping back to oral culture where people don't read books on their own time, and they don't even engage in the old school internet of 30 years ago of read-write culture, but we're just sharing these stories. And in that sense, it brings me to part two. So that's the end of part one. You can tune back in if you were kind of like, I'm gonna wait. How did so many people live through an election in 2020 and then watch it end and be told by all the traditional outlets, including Fox News, that the election was over and the president lost and President-elect Biden was going to take over? And then there were complaints, well, was this fair? And people filed appeals in court, as they're allowed to do. And all the appeals of those election results were rejected. And the Supreme Court, which is full of Republicans, didn't even take a challenge, let alone reverse the election. And we all lived through that together. So how is it that apparently tens of millions of people ended up suspicious, feeling, thinking, or convinced that the opposite happened? That the election was stolen from them, that Trump was actually the winner, et cetera. I think where we start there, which is the problem in our democracy right now, is also partly an outgrowth of what I just talked about. And some of them took criminal actions and have to be prosecuted, and if found guilty, incarcerated and pay their debt to society. That's some of them. But I also want to be clear, and if you watch The Beat, we've looked at this, we report on this. The majority of them didn't actually commit crimes. They didn't travel to D.C. And many of them are what you might call, and they're responsible. If you're an adult, you're responsible for what you think and what you do. But I think if we look at it carefully, many of them are what we might call disinformation recipients or disinformation victims. Some people don't like the word victim because, hey, they're not like other victims. But if they were given something false and then pushed into it and now accept it, we have to deal with that as a society. And I think the situation we're in is partly fed by these other problems. So in that sense, this stuff might be part of the new normal, not just, oh, that was Trump, oh, that was that era, which means it's as bad as you think it may be or worse. So that brings us into part two. I'll tell you more casually a couple stories about what I've been doing because I was in the trial and we got the election. And then we'll open up to questions and you can ask about any of this or other stuff. Does that sound fair? Good. Great. So more casually, because again, if you want to see it super formal, you have the show. But, I'll tell you, just sharing a little bit, I started, when I got out of law school, I was working at the public defenders in New York City. So that's the kind of job where everyone who got arrested last night in the city who can't afford a lawyer comes in and they go through arraignments. So people who have, even if you have a little money, let alone if you're doing well, you're going to get, you're going to call someone and somebody's going to come down there for you. So when you work in the New York Public Defenders, it's everybody else. So that was my crash course. I was coming to law school. I was doing that because I had this belief that I could help people that way. And I, in doing it, determined that I didn't think I could help people that way very much. And I also found it so personally depressing that I was like, I hope I can build skills. I don't think I'm going to spend decades doing this. And I know people who do public defender work, and if they're wired for it, great. But to me, it was like a trauma unit. So you go into 100 Center Street, which is the big New York City court, criminal court, and it's mostly black and brown people in New York, and it's overwhelmingly poor people. Every so often, there's someone who maybe just their life fell apart, right? So maybe it's a mental health or some other breakdown, but they have a family or job and you're trying to get them sorted. But the vast majority are poor people and black and brown people, and a lot of them are in for things that other people don't spend a night in jail for. Traffic-related offense, bar fight, drug use. I mean, if you're a drug dealer and you're running a gang, that's different, but drug use, there are, as you may have heard, white bankers in Manhattan who've been known to try drugs. I never saw one in there. And so that was my experience, and that's the last time I was down at 100 Center Street. So there's a bit of a personal part of it. But now I'm going right back to 100 Center Street in those same dingy courtrooms and seeing Donald Trump walk in and sit down and sit there quietly for 6 to 7 hours a day while this jury hears the evidence against him. And I don't talk about this as much on air because, we're doing the news, so I'm not going to make it all about whatever, my job history, but I'll tell you guys, since we're here today, one of the most striking things being there, I was there Thursday, for example, I'm sitting there and looking at it all, was how normal and regular it was. And I felt that was a good thing. I just told you about a bunch of stuff that might be bad. I felt like, 2 years ago, everyone said, if he were indicted, what would happen? And if he were on trial, and what would it do to our country? What would it do to security? And all these type of things. And then you sit there and you say, actually, it's fine. We as a society are still strong enough for this. He, going through it, I think, I can't tell you what the verdict's going to be and what it should be is not my job. I can tell you it is positive for the rule of law that anyone, including him, is subjected to this process. And it's a high bar. I can tell you that it's hard to convict people. It's supposed to be. And people with lawyers and defense usually do better than the other people, as I alluded to. But just sitting there, so it's like him there, and he's sitting there, and he's quiet, and he's just a person. And the jury's over here, and we describe them, their background information, but we don't say things that could identify who they are. But I can tell you it's mostly middle-aged, not super young, not super elderly. It's people dressed kind of normal, kind of like maybe professional class, and they look really attentive, and they're taking notes, and court can be boring. Like, the defendant Trump's not the only person who's fallen asleep in court. I've seen a lot of people fall asleep in court. He may sleep extra, maybe he's napping like a lot. But sometimes juries fall asleep. I've definitely seen that. And I have not seen any of them look like they're getting close to napping. They're all pretty attentive. And so one thought I had in covering all this was just how it's a good thing that we can actually do this as a society. It's interesting that it's happening in New York. That's where he spent most of his life and career. That's where these alleged incidents occurred. And so that's the positive. As for what's happening, I'll tell you, and I know you guys are all super informed, so I'm sure you have your own knowledge of what happened in the court this week. But having sat there and covered this and also dealt with a lot of these people, I mean, I've interviewed Michael Cohen many times. I interviewed Keith Davidson, who was Stormy Daniels' lawyer at the time of the alleged transaction. I've interviewed Michael Avenatti, who brought the case and then himself was convicted of a host of crimes. So I feel close to it. I observe, as an update for you here, that the prosecution was up and kind of on offense, as they should be, and making progress for the first, basically, 17 witnesses of this case. Now, they're in control of the witnesses, so there's, they should be on offense. But even the difficult witnesses, even Ms. Daniels, where she's, has some things that they could try to use against her, I felt and I observed that they did a really good job and they were on offense. And they obviously saved Cohen for last to try to say, well, we've basically proven the case, now there's this guy, and he's a liar, but I swear he's telling you the truth about the main thing. And over this week, and if you watch all the news, you guys have probably heard aspects of this and people are debating it, but it was like watching a case that had been up for so long start to really go back and pull even. And we still have to hear the rest next week. We still have to hear closing arguments, and I don't know what the jury's going to say. That's the beauty of our system. But knowing this all up close and seeing Michael Cohen, the big question was, can Michael Cohen keep it together? And I would argue that emotionally he did, because I've seen him fly off the handle, and he hasn't done that, and they did bait him. But intellectually, with regard to his statements and his ego, he hasn't kept it fully together. He's been saying things on the stand that they've argued, and we'll see, they've argued sound like new lies or spin, and the jury's hearing that. And they're not even all relevant to the case. There's him denying that he wanted this White House job, which is documented and we all know, and him spinning various things. And then there was a really important moment on Thursday, you guys may have followed, where the Trump lawyer was able to basically say to Cohen, you claim that the key moment you told Trump that the deal was done, which matters, so Trump is in on it, occurred on this 90-second cell phone call to his bodyguard. But here are all these texts beforehand where you were complaining about this other harassment security incident, and isn't that what this call was about? And aren't you lying? Basically making the argument that Cohen has tried to bolster or strengthen the case by adding details. I don't know whether he has or not. That's not really even the question. The question is whether one or more jurors hear all that and have reasonable doubt as to him telling the truth. So that is my update for you on that. Before we go to questions, the other thing I thought I'd share is thinking about the wider context that we're in, and that is for all the good part of the rule of law holding and a court doing this in New York, we're in this wider crisis where Donald Trump refused to leave the White House peacefully. We had an insurrection. Whether or not he's criminally culpable for that is a separate question, but we already know that he asked everyone to come to town and they committed an insurrection. Mitch McConnell called it an insurrection early in the morning of January 7th, and then our system outside of New York tried to deal with that. We had the first ever federal indictment of a former president, and we had these questions about whether we're going to deal with it. And I think it's a profound attack on the rule of law that the Supreme Court, aided by the people that he put on the court, have maneuvered it so we don't get an adjudication of that by the election. And that sort of means that the public result is you can interfere with the peaceful transfer of power, you can be affiliated with, and I say quite carefully, not convicted of, not at this moment, but affiliated with an insurrection, and then you can duck a trial. And if you can duck the trial, then what does it matter if you win? And so that's why I think we're in a very tough spot. And the wider context of that is we have this rule of law crisis that's combined with this democracy crisis. And the problem is, and the reason why they attack the rule of law so much is the rule of law is what we use to make sure we hold on to democracy. That's why when I mention, the Supreme Court didn't even take those election challenges, right? That's because if they did, as with Bush v. Gore, we understand that we would abide by that. The wider context of that, I think, is that we are living in a time where the national democracy, the way we allocate power, is not very competitive anymore. In national presidential elections, more people usually vote Democratic, and the Republican Party has decided as a kind of an organizational and political matter not to change or adjust to try to be more competitive, but just to dilute, attack, or undermine democracy so that it can hold on to power without winning elections. So that's a huge problem. One example you guys may know is in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, more people have voted for the Democrat. But we've had Republicans repeatedly take office because of those antiquated rules I mentioned in part 1. And so we've sort of normalized as a society a result that in other places, if you had a board meeting at a company and one side lost and then their policy or their chosen candidate took over, that would be very odd. And this is more important than a board meeting. And in other countries, other Western democracies, they look at this as very odd, and a lot of it is accidental. The founders didn't know with the Electoral College that it would lead to such different population densities because they didn't know that people wouldn't want to live in Alabama. They'd prefer to live in New York and LA, and that's like no shade on Alabama, but a lot of people move to a lot of different places. And so I think the larger problem we have is if we don't get the coup adjudicated with Donald Trump, which it looks very unlikely in the Supreme Court, and we go towards another election where that is now green lit, I think we'll have more, not fewer, of these problems. Lisa mentioned the piece I wrote about the January 6th report, and I quoted a writer in there, Doug Porter, who said, a failed coup without punishment becomes a training exercise. And so, again, I wanted to do a lot of negative in the beginning of the talk, but then end on like the lowest point, you know? So like, have a good Saturday night. The problem is not just people getting away with it. The problem is, against the backdrop of how much that side struggles to win elections in the first place and how far its adherents, its followers are willing to go, and the propaganda I mentioned, we are looking at a time where democracy itself, as you know, may be severely further constrained or efforts to end it in the United States. I joked about it being negative, so let me be a little positive before the questions. The best thing I can say is universal democracy is not what this country was founded on. It's not what this country had for most of the time. And it's not the history of self-rule in the world. It's something that is always under attack and difficult precisely because other methods, autocratic rule, strong man, strong person rule, or just rule by violence, which is what failed societies have, is always out there. So if we as a people, we as a subset of the population, people felt that this was all good, how can this be happening here? That's probably a misreading of how hard it is to do what we're trying to do as a country. And so we were founded as a non-democracy, land-holding, white male rule with language about being more empowered than the kingdoms, but most people in a type of servitude. Women got the right to vote in the 20s. Functionally, black Americans had that right without as much violent pushback in the 60s. And we have all these other structural systems I mentioned. So I think if we unhook from the idea of everything's falling apart, they're going to take it away, and re-engage with that, what I think is the true historical reality, which is this has never been easy. This hasn't been around a long time. And communities that care and people that want to stay involved, and other people, some people are busy just trying to make ends meet and not get evicted. But if you're in a position to be engaged and realize that this is an ongoing battle, like so many battles for what's hopefully better for people around the world, then it's one that we can still engage on. And I think it doesn't mean you're going to win, but it makes it less likely that you're going to lose. That's the best I can do for you before questions. Thank you for listening. And what I'd love to do, thank you. Thank you very much. We can bring the lights a little, thank you. You come on down for questions. I'll take two at a time. And what I would ask is feel free to tell us who you are if you want. Maybe try under 30 seconds, and it doesn't matter if it's a question or a comment. If there's something you want to share briefly, feel free to share. If you have a question, great. I'll take two at a time, starting right here. Welcome.
Ari, I'm one of your fans. I have a question. You started out by saying so many people accepted the BS that we got, and they lost the election, and they lost in the courts, and somehow it all looks like it never was happening. What happened? Why? Explain it. I mean, really.
Why do people believe it?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And one more.
Well, okay, this is not on that topic at all, but without mentioning specific names, it appears to me that all your colleagues at MSNBC do not agree on all issues, specifically around Israel. How do you negotiate that as a community at MSNBC, and how do you negotiate that personally?
So you want to start with easy questions.
Sorry, I prepped.
Why do people believe that? is, on the one hand, a bit above my or anyone's pay grade, but I do think that how people get information is part of it, and that's why when I mention, for example, all of our history, there's nothing new about attacks on democracy, violence, racism. The insurrection was new. And so I do believe that the breakdown of facts and information and the viral stuff that I analyzed is why it was worse, right? No one's saying that Donald Trump lying about the election is worse than Strom Thurmond running on segregation, or any number of assorted substantive examples we could pull from history. But the ability to get that many people to wage an actual attack based on lies, and if you look, many of them thought they were true, and I've covered these cases. Some of them took it back, retracted it later, but if you look even at sort of examples of internal emails and threads where they're talking amongst themselves, a lot of them believe it. I don't think Steve Bannon believed it. I've interviewed him. He was convicted. He's headed to prison. He was a leader of it. But why I say disinformation recipients in conjunction with technologies, I think a lot of them did come to believe it. And then it's that thought experiment, which, again, we need to have some empathy. We don't have to have the most empathy for the people doing the worst things. But I do think that if you want to understand things, yes, you have to get in the mindset of, well, if someone believed these three things for real, then they would be this mad and they'd be willing to take these risks. And so I think that's the interplay partly. The other question is a different topic and an important one. I don't believe as a news organization that we are seeking agreement or consensus on policy or what should be done on any topic. We have to have facts and standards. But in general, when I go to work, first of all, I'm not constantly watching every other hour. I couldn't watch every other hour and prepare for my own work. Or if I'm in the courtroom, I'm not watching MSNBC. So I'm coming out and telling you what I saw. But if somebody 5 minutes earlier said something different, great, that's okay. So I don't think we're building consensus as a project. But we have, for example, standards. We have a new standards and lawyers division. There's certain stories that go through things when we're reporting out facts, right? We sometimes will have conversations during the day about, is this reportable, which means can this go to air? And sometimes something is in a certain website, but it's not reportable. In that sense, everyone's supposed to work off those measures. As for me personally, I don't want to duck the question. I think it's difficult, complex. We're all human beings, so we bring our own personal understandings of the world from our own life, but as a journalist, you're often trying not to let that be the beginning or the end of your work. So when I cover civil rights and BLM, I don't begin on Team White or end on Team White. If I look at the issues around women's health, rights, and abortion, I don't come at it as Team Men and say, well, I'm never going to need one, so is that right as important to me personally? No. I cover it as a reporter and attorney. So I do try to bring that lens to covering the Mideast, which is a very difficult issue, but I'm also Jewish, and I'm also, my father's an immigrant, and I have that background. So I guess I would say that I'm aware of it, but if anything, on those stories, I think extra about trying to be fair and not try to be on a team. And I don't think it's helpful. Again, people, if you're a guest, an activist, those are different things. But if you're actually trying to have, like during that story, we had people on who reside in Israel. We had people who've resided in Gaza and the territories. We had on Ehud Barak. We had on the UN Palestinian Authority representative. People can make up their own minds. Not all issues need to be 50-50, but I would hope that people watching The Beat would say, oh, okay, I learned, I heard from everybody, and then you decide. The pre-deciding is almost, I think, one of the larger problems we have. Two more. Thank you.
That was very heartwarming to hear you're talking about how MSNBC is working. But I probably like many of us, I always felt like the one institution we can count on for talking truth is the New York Times. All the news is fit to print is what I grew up on. And we just listened to Frank Bruni being interviewed, who's an opinion writer for the New York Times and now works at Duke. And he said something that I found, and it's consistent with what you were talking about, so incredibly upsetting, that the New York Times, when they have a headline that they're doing, puts out 3 or 4 of them and goes to see how many hits they get.
Right.
And the one that gets the most hits that's the one they put in the newspaper, which means they too are now just responding to what's going to make the most money with the most number of people. Can you talk about that and how common that is?
Yeah.
Hi, Ari. I'm Jen. Okay, so you talked about oral history and then, how we went into a reader history and then alluded to this read-write situation that we're in now. And I just want to dig in a little bit on that because the oral history and the reading reference history, I think we all would assume were based on facts or how many facts somebody could remember as they relay a story, from one to the next, to the next, to the next. But what I see today, and I do see a lot of TikTok and Facebook and et cetera, is this, if we categorize today as read-write responses, there's this, it sounds like someone is reading and then writing a response from facts. And that's not what I experience, so I'll see somebody put out a fact and then a response that says, I reject your fact, here's my opinion, and my opinion is now fact. And the king of that would be the former president who's created this. He doesn't rewrite history, he just creates his own history. He creates his own reality. And many of those followers are doing the same. They're just like, we're not in Great Barrington, we're in Chicago. Right. I don't know what's wrong with you, we're in Chicago. And so I think I'd like to hear from you where you're at with, it's not a time where we're dealing with a subsect of public that is responding to facts, but responding to whatever they want to, make up.
I hear that. So I'll start with that one. I mean, I think we're having the dialogue about that, and are we talking about at the surface level of what you actually live and see? If someone says X and someone else just says that's not true, or the what I'm calling the culture underneath that. And so it's not to say that everything was perfect or better in a different mode, but that if we and the next generation become more of an oral culture, I think we have more of those kind of problems. There might be other positives. There's definitely a lot of speed and interaction, and I mentioned there's creativity, but those are the problems. And the extreme of the read culture, as I mentioned, is only looking at foundational texts is actually bizarre. Again, if it's religious and you think it came from God, then you have that view, and that makes some sense, right? Although I did burn out on my Talmud study young. But that's sort of at a very personal spiritual level. But at a legal level, the idea that in a read culture, we continue to look to the dead text, right, is itself bizarre. Even though if you go to law school, like you're ingrained, that's what's ingrained, and then you have all these Supreme Court justices debating it. And then one of the questions is, do you think they're even really doing that? Or are they playing this fake shell game about, oh, look, I found this other history book that says abortion should be illegal. Let's do that. And you sort of don't even believe it. But to your question, I do think that the typology of the read-write and oral cultures allow for a lot less fidelity to facts. That's my observation, and that's why I think we have to look at that more deeply as to what we're in, and then say what kind of society do we want, and then also how do we deal with and regulate that. In other words, TikTok is great for music. You notice I didn't hate on discovering new music on TikTok. The stakes are a little lower, but it's really great for that. Maybe we need to be clear about when we're talking about entertaining ourselves or doing fiction, which is really fun, and when we're doing facts and democracy, right? And so do we care and do we regulate that? If we're a nation of laws, I mean, if they can govern whether or not you're allowed to see your doctor or what happens to your uterus, certainly we can govern whether for-profit corporations are just wantonly spewing lies to make money that undermine our democracy, right? It's like that. So I'm not here to give you a fake bill and say this is how we should exactly do it, but that's the kind of conversation I'm provoking, hopefully. As for the New York Times, yeah, it's really interesting. I think they call that A/B testing, where online you have different headlines, and the story might stay the same, and so you could argue that the core of it's the same, but one headline says, Michael Cohen torches Trump, comma, but runs into some walls. And another headline says, Michael Cohen runs into some walls, comma, while trying to torch Trump. And the question isn't the English school question of what's a better headline, that's sort of substantive. But if you just test what gets more clicks and then that becomes the story, you're creating a feedback loop that starts with, oh, it's pretty similar in just the words, and ends with, you can't trust anything because it's all been corrupted, even at a good paper. So I will say the example was given. I said that's A/B testing because I've heard of A/B testing. I don't personally know whether that's what the Times is doing or what Frank said, so I'd have to look into that to know more about it. But I think in general, those pressures exist across a lot of the media. They exist with TV ratings. They exist with print. I think they're wholly lesser problems than what I mentioned in social media, but we all have to be conscious of them, and they are challenges.
Hi, my name's Paul. I'm a retired teacher. You mentioned earlier about after Trump filed those 60 appeals to overturn the election, they were going to send it to the Supreme Court and they wouldn't take it. So when I heard that, I felt I had some confidence in the Supreme Court. Now they're taking his total immunity thing and considering it after it was rejected by a lower court. Obviously, there's two justices that are conflicted. You got the stuff that's going on with Clarence Thomas and all the gifts and stuff he's taking. And now you have Samuel Alito with the upside-down flag on his house.
Yeah.
So they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to be down the middle. I mean, you know, but I don't know. What do you think about that,
Yeah.
you, as a lawyer?
Yep. Great question. SCOTUS. One more here.
You've talked a lot about adherence to facts and corporate culture and the structure at MSNBC. Can you explain anything about the Ronna McDaniel debacle?
Ronna McDaniel, who was sort of briefly hired and then
with
relieved of her
apparently
service.
no input from the on-air,
Sure.
personalities and.
Sure. So the Supreme Court is supposed to be independent, and it doesn't have an army. It doesn't even do press releases. It doesn't make its own TikToks to promote itself. It's supposed to be this authority in our government, and I think it has always had its problems, and it's had rulings that are wrong. But the current court has not all, but several Republican appointees who have already been caught in the types of things that in a different era would be grounds for impeachment and removal. We're in a polarized era where that has just diluted into a political process, and no one expects that there's not the votes for that. So if there's not the votes, then you don't see it happen. But you have members of the court like Justice Thomas, who's taken more private money through gifts and services than his annual salary, which raises a very fair question of who he works for. And as a comparison, Congress is a very low bar. You cannot legally do that in Congress. Senator Menendez is a Democrat who's accused of taking outside funds in ways that compromised his work, and he's on a criminal trial. And we'll see what the trial finds. But in other branches of government, you cannot do that. And Thomas has been actually already busted for that. The Justice Alito story is pretty new, and it does involve some interpretation. I just want to be as precise and fair as possible because they're flying this upside-down flag, and then they're defending or describing what that means, and is it a family member's flag, is it his flag? It's a little different than Thomas directly taking the funds, although, yes, I also think that raises questions about whether he has joined a cause that has a conflict of interest. And then you say, what cause is it? People have strong views, for example, on healthcare and choice rights in this country. Some people strongly, most people, if you look at the surveys, 55 to 60% of people strongly believe it should be a women's right. About 35 to 40% About 35 to 40% strongly believe that the government should restrict it on moral and religious grounds. Those are strong, different views. If a justice holds one of those views, I would tell you they're in a large grouping of people about an issue that has been legislated on both sides. By contrast, if Justice Thomas's wife, who was caught texting people about overthrowing the government, and Justice Alito's wife, who apparently, again, depending on how you view the story, is waving the flag of the convicted sedition, Proud Boy cause, right? We have a very big problem. And so the question is, what do you do about that? Can you get majorities to sanction that? Do you change the rules? Do you add a code of ethics that is binding, which means that those type of things would be punished or cause removal, which means hopefully they might not happen? Do you expand the membership of the court, which is something FDR and others have floated, but has pros and cons? I think you absolutely have to hold the line that this is not normal, and if it were exposed that a justice's spouse had strong views either way on abortion, I would call that very different than joining the sedition, right? This is a red alert. So that's my view on that. As for Ronna McDaniel, I used to practice law, so my lawyer would tell you I was not consulted and was not involved in that decision. Which is true. But I think you're asking something broader than that, which is what's the difference between seeking other views, making sure they're heard, interviewing a wide range of people, and hiring, paying, bringing into the newsroom people. And I think there is a big difference. And so as a general matter, there are people who I would definitely interview who I wouldn't recommend hiring in the newsroom. So in the last few weeks, RFK Jr. is running for president, and I had him on the program, and we had a discussion, and some people listened to it, and some people said they'd rather turn it off. That's fine. Some people listened to it and said, I trust him less, having heard this interview. Thank you for conducting it. But that's very different than saying we should hire him, or hire him as a vaccine correspondent. So, again, I want to be respectful of the whole... I want to be respectful of the whole process, but as a general matter, I think it's fully fair to note that difference. And I do think what was discussed out of that, which is, do we want to hear more voices and make sure people hear things directly? I'm with that. It's not the same as having them over for dinner. Like I mentioned Mr. Bannon, I've never had him over for dinner, and I've never recommended you do. But when I landed that interview, he was fresh out of Donald Trump's White House. Donald Trump was president at the time, and he had not appeared on MSNBC before. So I felt if I could get a sit down with him, we would do that interview. Other people can judge how it was, but I can tell you it was different from him being on his own War Room podcast, and it was different than Fox. So that's a process. There are other people who would say, it's too far. I don't even want to talk to him. Fine. But again, I wouldn't hire Steve Bannon as a democracy correspondent. I have like 10 more of those if we like that. All right, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a news junkie, so I was shocked when the Supreme Court took the immunity case at all. And what troubles me is it doesn't matter what they decide, because the fact that they took it nullifies whether we ever hear a case. And what's going on in Florida is unbelievable at best. So the documents case and the immunity case, the insurrection case never get heard. If heaven forbid he wins, they go away. Now, yes. What with Alito now flying the flag upside down, although he never sees it, only his wife sees it. Clarence Thomas driving around in his SUV. What do we do? Because what Senator Whitehouse wants to do and is trying very hard to do in regulating or putting some roadblocks into this kind of nonsense, what do we do? Because it seems to me that this is a lost cause. That's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah. Little applause for the lost cause. Yes, sir.
One more question. My name is Josh. I'm a retired business consultant here. My wife and I are great fans, and I would like your opinion as to whether it's too late for Biden to take Mitt Romney's suggestion. Pardon Trump, get him out of the way, take the wind out of his sails for a while, and move on.
Meaning just the pardon is your idea. That would, and then he would still, Biden would still run, but you're saying, what about a pardon? Okay.
Pardon, get the idea of
Okay.
you know.
And you might be the last questioner, so maybe we'll let you go as well. And then I got notes.
Okay, hi Ari. Knowing what you know so far about Donald Trump and the trial, if you were his lawyer, would you put him on the stand? And do you think he'll go on the stand?
Great. All right, so these will be, and thanks everyone for spending time with us and your interest and patience. These will be the final three questions. I think we saw the example with President Ford pardoning Nixon. That is the precedent, as the lawyers say. And I don't think it aged well. And I think it complicated what was the norm and tradition, which was, as a president, you have great power and you can't generally be prosecuted while in office. But in the back of your mind, as you wield this power to kill abroad, to wage war, to drop a nuke, yes, someday you'll be a citizen again. And I think that pardon has a poor record for that reason. So I don't think as a general matter, it's not my job to tell the current president what to do, but if you're asking my views, I don't think legally it's a good idea to encourage that. And I don't think, as I mentioned, going down to the arraignments and seeing the disparities we have in power, in race, in class, in money, I don't think the lessons of the criminal justice system in America are that the uber elites need more super protections. Quite the opposite. And we're here up in this Northeast area. It's like the bankers say, oh, you know, if you criminalize banking, you know what's going to happen? It's like, well, we've never tried. So you're good. Because you can make a lot of mistakes in a financial crash. You don't see bankers go to prison. I'm not saying they should necessarily, but that's not the main problem. So likewise, I don't think that's been the history if you're asking me legally. As for the SCOTUS immunity and the lady mentioned waving that flag, do we have any Deadheads here? We are, you know, do we have any Grateful Dead fans? Only a couple. They, you know, US Blues wave that flag, wave it high. A lot of people have the blues over finding out this is how bad it is at the Alito household. The thing they did on immunity is a lawyer trick. Of course, they could hear the case under expedited review. They've done other things fast when they want. No one has seriously suggested that they can't touch the case. But they have done a lot of things that the fairest way I can say it is, there's overwhelming evidence that they're running out the clock and slowing down this case so that the defendant cannot be put on trial before the election. So while they have a lot of high-minded talk about other things, they look like they're playing the election calendar game. That's bad on its face, even if you didn't care about the outcome. That's bad. On top of that, it looks corrupt because they're helping the person who put them on the court, and it would be legal if he becomes president for him to dissolve federal cases. That would be legal, and so if he loses, that case may ultimately happen, but if he wins, he will have effectively avoided trial because of his buddies on the court. I think that's a bad thing. Would you put Donald Trump on the stand if you represented him? Not in a million years. And what's interesting is there's a thing, I'm sure there's some lawyers in the audience, you know, in criminal trials, like in corporate law, there's a million lawyers, and there's a board lawyer, and there's a general counsel, and there's often an outside law firm. In criminal law, sometimes you're it. In this situation, and I did, like I mentioned, very briefly worked as a legal aid in criminal law, I think you would have an ethical duty to resign in protest before letting a liar like him on the stand. Because he's a habitual liar, as his defender and lawyer, you have to know that we're going to create new crimes and perjury, let alone also potentially lose the case. So no, I definitely wouldn't put him on the stand. I will say in closing, I appreciate everyone coming out on a Saturday. when we do the news, sometimes we add guests and we have the videos and we have fun things, and sometimes I mention a lyric. What I did today was more just a version of Unplugged without any of that stuff. So if you found it a little more dry and boring than you were expecting, we ain't on TV. And if you found it okay, I appreciate it. I'll say hi to you guys out in the front too. Thank you. Thank you.